I'm not going here to evaluate any software or tell you what to buy. But what I'm just saying is that the starting point for measurements, that starts by understanding what you're measuring. If we can take this analysis and basically embed it in the way we play, then we have something that's quite unique. Then we have something that actually helps players. The model is basically three things. It's pre-decision, it's decision making, and it's feedback, right? So first you gather information through attention scanning, pattern recognition, and situational assessment. Then there's a decision being made by your brain, and it's most of the time completely unconscious. And then, given what happens, your system will now give you feedback to next time do this or do that, or highly flexible players will change quickly, less flexible players will probably not change. Yeah, make sure you understand the context of the data, because AI hasn't watched the match. It's just watched the data. And the data is not perfect.
Hello, coaches. Welcome back to another Modern Soccer Coach podcast. Big one today. We are joined by Jess Buster Madsen to talk about football intelligence. Jess is a world leader in the application of cognitive neuroscience in football. He is currently the director of football and data science for the Saudi Pro League. And he was also the head of research and development at FC Copenhagen. You're going to love this interview. Some unbelievable insights around decision making, cognitive neuroscience, and coaching. If you enjoy it, please make sure you like, please make sure you subscribe, and please make sure you check out Modern Soccer Coach Insider for more exclusive coaching content. Thanks so much. Here's Jess. Enjoy. Jess, thanks so much for joining me today on the Modern Soccer Coach podcast. Really, really excited to have you on.
Yeah, thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
What a topic! What a topic this is. Where do we start? I've decided to change my opening question. The one I sent you, of course, of course. Football intelligence. Just had a quick chat there, and I said like there's a lot of selling in football intelligence. There's a lot of commercialization. Football intelligence is being used today probably more than ever, in my opinion. It's often used loosely. How would you define it from a neuroscientific point of view, or just your definition of it?
I mean, now you're actually starting with what I would almost call the final question. In consciousness research, there's this thing called the heart problem, and the problem is basically not defining what consciousness is, but why we have consciousness. And some people think you could never answer that. And I feel game intelligence is landing close to those types of questions, because when I initially started in football, this was actually the task I was given by the now sporting director in FC Copenhagen, Sune Schmidt Nielsen. He wanted me to create a way to measure and predict game intelligence in academy players and first team players. And so what I basically came back with was to say, well, let's remove this idea of game intelligence. Okay, I'm not saying, because I know there's great scholars out today like Mark Williams and others that have theories and ideas about it, and there's ways to measure game intelligence. But my approach was to say game intelligence is a concept that is highly complicated. It's quite subjective, and I also believe that there's a lot of bias in it. So we tend to say central mids, offensive mids are more game intelligent than others. But I didn't want to come out with an answer saying, well, all your central mids are more game intelligent than your left backs or your goalkeepers. So what I did was basically to come back to Sune and say, well, game intelligence isn't really interesting. Let's not talk about it, because whenever we talk about it, we get confused. Instead, what I proposed was to basically create a test that would measure on specific cognitive functions, and thereby say, well, does this person have a well-functioning cognitive perceptual system? And if they do, we believe that there's a higher probability of them being game intelligent. And that was the way we tried to solve it, and that was the way we always talked about it. So we actually said, don't talk about game intelligence, it's just confusing. Interestingly, we did a study in FCK Talent where I asked all coaches to rate all players in their team, from U14 to first team, from 1 to 10 on game intelligence. And then I asked them to write their definition of game intelligence. And really interestingly, the rate, the rate of game intelligence within coaches was very, very highly correlated. So the difference was 0.7 in rating. So it's they agreed who's game intelligent and who's not, but their definitions were not the same at all. So they would focus on different things. Some would focus on scanning, other on, positioning, other on decision making. So, people agree, but they don't agree for the same reasons. So that's why we needed this kind of more objective way of measuring something. So I would never say that cognitive science is actually measuring game intelligence because I don't have a definition of it. But I would argue that whatever you define what it is, the the better cognitive perceptual system a player has, the more likely you are to rate him high.
Well, let's go back a couple of steps. This neuroscience in football, although it is of like the complexity. Just going through these questions, I'm looking and thinking, I don't know whether I'm actually if if the more I learn about football, the looser my understanding of this stuff gets, because you do find your biases and your experiences. I do anyway. What sparked your curiosity to connect neuroscience with football, and why do you think the gap existed for so long?
The first question, if we start with that, is that I was, during my education, I studied philosophy, especially philosophy of mind. Then I studied cognitive neuroscience. Then I went on to get a scholarship at the University of Arizona, where I studied medical pharmacology. And then I went back home to Denmark, where I was then lecturing in neuroplasticity and methods of neuroscience. And at some point, I then said, okay, let's go back to research. But then COVID came. And actually, the study that I was doing was all on human participants. So we had to kind of stop the project, and I didn't really have any clear project anymore, unfortunately. But then I realized, because I was offered a job by someone who worked within the cognitive performance field, that, actually there's not a lot of knowledge about the brain in sports performance. And this is because this company was selling their product to clubs. And I just thought, how can the clubs evaluate whether this is a good product or not? Because you need actually quite a lot of expertise in these things. So I did something crazy. I basically just called FC Copenhagen and asked them for a meeting. And for some reason, I think it was because it was COVID, because they would never just say yes to that normally. They invited me in, and I had a presentation basically telling them, don't buy anything, don't do anything, sit down, read a book on neuroscience, create a theory of cognition in football, and from that, you can work, right? So if you think about it, like if you were to study, um, like GPS systems, right? As you do today, you monitor load, right? But you want to understand what movement is, what physical load is, and have a theory about it before you start to measure. And that was my whole point. Like, why are you measuring anything if you don't have a theory about it? And then they basically they offered me the job as head of research and development in the club. And from that, I then started develop the model that we published last year in December together with Copenhagen University. So that is how I got into it. And then just I never looked back. I love football. I love the complexity of football data, the complexity of football neuroscience. And I think that actually one of the previous, topics that I was always so invested in, which is consciousness, is actually gonna probably get many insights through the neuroscience of sports, or basically human motion. Because when you move and you play sports, you're moving and you're thinking and you're making decisions and you're doing everything. It's a completely multimodal modal. So maybe sports is even the key to unlocking the question that I started with when I was 19.
You were skeptical of, and we talked about this just before we started recording about this commercialization with brain training and neuroscience, and how I said I might insult you with challenging a couple of things, but that's largely where it comes from for me. Is that, especially in the United States, there's a new product in the market every 6 months that's going to change the way people think. Now, you being, you pushing back or being skeptical on that there, and saying, listen, you need a theory before you decide. Is that how you would, is that the starting point for this, for coaches and clubs understanding this area?
Well, I mean, that's what I've been arguing, I think, for the last couple of years. And so I want to make clear that I'm not saying don't buy any software. I'm not going here to evaluate any software or tell you what to buy. But what I'm just saying is that the starting point for measurements, that starts by understanding what you're measuring. That would be my basic understanding. I mean, otherwise, like, how do I make decisions on what matters and why it matters? And so, we use different types of softwares in FC Copenhagen, but that's because we were identifying what did we want to know from that software, what could it give us, and what can it give us. And so, I mean, if you're aligned on that, then I think you have a great starting point. But the next question is then, Gary, what is a measurement, right? Because actually, what we ended up spending the most time on was actually measuring video analysis, basically utilizing the tool of analysts that are tagging, hundreds of sequences every week. And we said, wait a minute, like, what we're interested in is behavior on the pitch. I'm not interested in your score in some kind of test. I'm interested in how do you play. And if we define then the cognitive functions within behaviors, that's for me when we really started to get insights, because that is when we started to, you know, really go deep with how like, I'll give you an example on attention. Like, where is this player looking? And I'm not talking about scanning, just where is this player looking
Mm.
when he's on the pitch? What is his attention towards? And then the next question is, how is he then collecting that information? And that is then the methodology of scanning, which Gaia Jordet, of course, and Karl Marius Axum have been great in developing, and I owe them a lot in my own thinking. But I think, took it as maybe a step further, because we were actually delivering something on a daily basis to players and to coaches that needed us to understand also the style of play, right? So, and anyone who does data analysis would know this, that you know a player that's playing for a specific team might have a very low passing completion, right? But that doesn't necessarily make him a bad passer, because you need to be able to see, is he being asked to make the longest possible pass whenever he gets the ball as a six, or is he being asked to play it backwards? Because that affects his completion score. So we need to know the context that the data is produced in, or we need to know the context of the cognitive functions that they're being asked to deliver. And that's where I think we had a real eureka moment in understanding, if we can take this analysis and basically embed it in the way we play, then we have something that's quite unique. Then we have something that actually helps players. And it's not just telling them your frequency is too low. or your timing is not good. Well, depends. What are we asking him to do?
I love that. I love that. I find it so fascinating because I completely agree with you. Even though we are moving to more data-driven insights, I think especially youth development, where a lot of it is player assessment, player evaluations. I don't think a coach really resonates with a score versus a score. So I think for you there to say that, okay, you started with a understanding the cognitive function to build into the understanding of neuroscience. If you put 20 coaches that I would know in a room, even 20 of the people how I'd rate the highest, and you said, all right, let's talk about cognitive function, you'll have a few people doing this here and looking away. I mean, how do you draw coaches into looking a bit deeper beyond buzzwords? How does that process work?
That's a really good question. So, I think one of the brilliant things that they 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 did to me in Copenhagen was to just tell me, you need to follow every team for 2 weeks. So I followed U13, I followed U17, I followed first team, I followed everyone to understand the mechanics of what happens and what is the coach actually saying and what does he actually need to do. And me coming with some graph showing correlations or statistical significance is not going to make him change his mind. And so that's when we basically changed the vocabulary to a style of play vocabulary. So I mean, I can give you an example, and I use this example quite a lot. So um, when you're an eight, right, and you receive the ball in the middle space, um, what well, I'm not gonna explain what Copenhagen is doing, but but they would play a 4-3-3. And the first thing is that you actually want this player not to receive with his back to the goal, right? You actually wanted to receive it on sideways. So that's an idea from body positioning, but it's also an idea regarding scanning. And then before he receives, you could either say scan, right? Which is people are saying scan, scan before you receive. We changed that and we just said you first need to check for your left wing to your right wing, right? Because when you're looking for the right wing, you see the striker as well. So these are high valued priority targets that has a decision within it, right? A scan doesn't have a decision. A left and a right wing is a decision for you to understand where are they compared to where I am. So you're changing the language from scanning technique to basically the eight in that position. Those are the two targets that you want to be looking for. And it's way easier to coach. And two, it's way easier to see whether he did it or not. Right? Because some players can probably scan 5 times before receiving, but never looked to the right wing. So that was a way of trying to change that vocabulary into something the coach can actually say on the pitch, and not just me delivering a PowerPoint on scanning is important, and it increases your amount of forward passing, right? So that was our idea about it, and we developed this for strikers, for defenders, for right backs, left backs, in trying to say what is actually the coaching point for these positions within comparing. And so I think the most important insight or idea, I think that for me, is actually quite basic. And if you look at the cognitive model that we proposed, the model is basically three things. It's pre-decision, it's decision making, and it's feedback, right? So first you gather information through attention scanning, pattern recognition, and situational assessment. Then there is a decision being made by your brain, and it's most of the time completely unconscious. And then, given what happens, your system will now give you feedback to next time do this or do that, or you know, highly flexible players will change quickly. Less flexible players will probably not change. But the main idea is actually that when you receive the ball, you are at stage two. Never receive the ball in stage one.
Yeah.
And, you know, you should already be ready to play the ball when you receive. That is the idea. Because if you do that, you play probably a second faster. And now your opponent is constantly in his stage one. Right? So you're making him constantly be analyzing of what you're doing. Rather, if you receive, you then start to analyze, then you're losing a second where your opponent now has that 1 second to pressure you, tackle you, get the ball. So it's an idea of how do we play faster, and how do we utilize this fact about cognitive processing in a way that it becomes faster. So we would spend time on preparation. How is the player preparing for the situation? And given the position and the cognitive abilities, we could then give feedback to, well, how do you basically make the process better? Because remember, and yeah, I'll just keep talking. Sorry. So
Yeah.
re- remember that I'm the neuroscientist, right? I'm not the head coach. So I don't think it's my job to tell the player where to play the ball. It's not my job to analyze whether he played the ball the right place. My job is to make sure that whatever you are saying as a coach, the player can understand and execute, right? Because that's the preliminary phase to actually doing what you want him to do. Because if the player is not cognitively up to speed and preparing correctly, you might want him to play the striker deep, but he doesn't have the time and he's not prepared, so he's not going to play the ball anyhow. So no matter what stupid tactics the coach has, my job is to make sure that the players are cognitively ready for that. Just like it's the fitness coach job to make sure they are physically ready for that, and the rehab guy is to make sure that he's actually on the pitch.
Yeah, I'm gonna pull up your model here and have it on the screen so people can see it. You're saying there, this is great. The S1, S2, S3, all the scan and attention components, they have to be related to a component of the state of play, or in the traditional scanning model, is that just too open for, hey, they looked around the pitch? Is that what you're saying the key difference at the start is?
Well, I can't talk about Karl Mayus or Guy Jordat's stance on it. I'm sure they have, you know, a good way of explaining their stance. But for us, what just came apparent is that people would say scanning is important, and then scanning would be kind of like an isolated technique. And what we're saying is that that doesn't make any sense. Like, why you wouldn't isolate it? Because this is actually decision making, and therefore you cannot just view scanning in isolation. You need to view scanning in relation to many other things. And so, pattern recognition is something that is actually extremely important to understand and think about, because now it's getting a bit philosophy of mind technical, but in reality, you don't look at the world and then analyze it, right? You don't see a picture and then you say that's a horse and that's a car or whatever. What you do is that you actually have a preconceived pattern to recognize what you see. So when you look at the world, you're already laying a foundation on it, right? Because you're only seeing the patterns that you know. So that's why tactical training and doing tactical training sufficiently and well is very important for your players to be able to identify the patterns you want quickly. So it's not enough just to have a 360 view of the world. It's actually more important to have the patterns recognized that are important and being drilled in them. And then, of course, having the ability to actually seek them out in the environment. But so it's a kind of opposite of what people think, because, you know, a visual illusion works because you're putting a pattern or an expectation on it that makes you see a visual illusion. If you didn't do that, there wouldn't be a visual illusion.
If I'm going off on a way off on a wrong tangent here, you catch me, or you disagree with me. But I think what you're saying there is because people say, okay, if you're going to do a go, you're referencing a 4-3-3 system, and I'm coaching 4-3-3, and I'm using your model, and I say, okay, 15 minutes per session, I'm going to do attacking patterns, full pitch patterns. Now, people will say, well, that lacks decision making, that lacks scanning, that lacks reality. But what you're saying there is that actually can paint the picture into the recognition component where the player can actually start to see that. Would that be right?
But I'm not saying that you should play 11 versus 0 because then you're not actually learning the other big parts of patterns, which are really important, is how is my opponent moving, right? But you cannot isolate those two, right? But you might want to know as a aid in the 4-3-3, how do I solve the situations against opponents playing a 4-5-1 or a 4-3-2, right? So that is actually how you lay that foundation for pattern recognition, which is about if I move here, they move there, we can play the ball in that direction. So I would never argue that playing 11 versus 0 is the answer. Uh, but some people might still do it. But because this is the brain, like the brain is highly complicated. It's not just the you know the brain knows that it's not playing against anyone, right? Because you know that, right? So you want to train it in circumstances that live up to the reality they're meeting. But you might still say that you know before we go into 11 versus 11, we start at smaller scales, but we still keep those patterns that we're interested in. But I think that is also, basic methodology within football training. The idea of progressing the complexity more and more until you play 11 versus 11.
I love it. I love it. Okay, going back to the example you used was I think you said the 8 was to look at the 7 and the 11, and so you're looking at key reference points. How do you measure that?
So I mean that's a bit of a that's the secret, right?
Oh, it's the sneaker.
But okay, so but what I will say is I'm not gonna tell you the whole methodology of it. But I'll tell you one thing. So for one, try just to sit with a tactical camera and look at one player for 90 minutes. Try to do that. I don't know if you've ever done it. Try to
I've
do
done it plenty of time. Yeah, yeah.
that. And so that is the first start, right? We try basically not to isolate him from the game, but we're trying to understand not only what is he doing on the ball, but also what strategies does he have when he's not on the ball? Because that is very, very often very, very telling of the player. And then we had specific types of behaviors in terms of positioning, in terms of scanning, and in terms of decision making that we would then tag. So where is he positioning himself in relation to the ball or teammates? How is he gathering information to be in this position, and how well is he doing that? And what is he doing with the ball? So if you then do that, let's say you have like 5 tags per possession, then you end up with a lot of data points telling you something about behavior. And if you start doing that on a big scale, you end up with loads of data points on behavior that you can end up using to correlate with up to event data and start to see what of these behaviors that we are interested in actually has an impact on performance on measurable data. So you're basically creating a bespoke data set that allows you to gain new insights. And we had some quite interesting things that we never thought about that has impact on how players are executing specific tasks. But one thing I think is really important when we talk about scanning is that so the way that most of the scanning research was done was basically looking at players before receiving the ball, right? But a player, a player that has the ball a lot has maybe the ball maximum 2 minutes in a game. So what you end up doing is that you're being very centric on possession. And what happened was that, especially in Denmark, so many clubs started doing this scanning training, where you have someone standing there with their back to the goal. Someone played the pass, and they looked left, right, and they said yellow or green cone, right? But what you're doing now is then you're just replicating a scientific methodology because Guy Jordet, for obvious reasons, didn't have any other way to quantify it, right? He needed the player to get the ball. So he's quantifying when you receive possession because that was a great way of quantifying at that time. But in reality, there's tons of situations. For one, you don't want the player to stand with his back to the goal. Two, you don't want him to look at cones because the cones is not that relevant because it's not a decision. You actually want real people moving. But the third thing is that there's tons of movements and decisions in the game where you're not on possession, and it's probably 98% of all movements. So we changed that paradigm and we said, okay, now we just look at specific movements. So if you look at strikers, you just look at all the deep runs, all the time they enter the box. And then you do the analysis on all of that instead of just looking at the times he scored, right? Because in today's data, you actually the goal or the pass doesn't really matter. Well, it does. But if you remove that and you just add the XG or the XA or the position value, then you're just saying, I don't care if the pass actually ended up where it should be or if it ended in the back of the goal. I'm just taking all situations where he had a shot, and then I'm taking the average XG of that, and then looking at how was the scanning or the preparation going into that shot in the average XG compared to when he didn't do it. That's a way better way because now you're not caring so much about the outcome or the success. You're rather looking at the you know the averagely good decision or the average high outcome of that given decision. Or think about a defender in a low block, uh, having to defend crosses. He doesn't hit the ball all the time, but he might still have done the preparation so that he didn't have to defend the ball. So we would take all those situations and see what is he doing there, what is he doing then. Uh, Really importantly, I think as well for uh, right backs, left backs in terms of offside, looking at how well are they in all of these positions to make sure that the offside line is drawn because that's very scan intensive actually. You have to scan constantly to see where you are. How well are they doing that in all those situations? So that's why I'm saying if you look at him at a right back for 90 minutes, you're attacking for upholding the offside line and you're attacking for how is he doing that on average, no matter if the ball is played or not. So, um, so there's many areas we can go down on, and we shouldn't think about the scientific method as the way of understanding it. That's just a way for Guy Yorda to do the research he did, which was amazing and groundbreaking. Yeah.
I agree. I think Guyer's been unbelievable in leading the charge on this. But I think, as with most people who are breaking through, and even Guardiola suffers with this, there's a people people will grab, or people will assess something differently. It's not necessarily the person's fault who brought it in. It's the other people's fault. And I think the one that Geyer, unfortunately, I think that the Lampard clip of the basically head on a swivel. It now seems that everyone's looking to do that as effective football. But actually, like you don't know, like nobody plays like that when you watch these guys up close. So do you think we do kind of we're still looking at this from a surface level in terms of coaching community?
Um, well, that would be, well, I can't speak for all coaching communities, but I would say that it's what the message that I have regarding the style of play specific scanning. It's not something that I hear a lot, and I don't think a lot of people are saying that at the moment. But I think it's extremely important. If we look at Savi, who is one of the players who had the highest recorded scan frequency, there's also another thing that Savi had. That is, he played on one of the teams that was the strongest on pattern recognition that we've ever seen. So I would argue that Savi wasn't just scanning, Savi knew where the players were supposed to be. So his scanning was living up to what I would argue is the intentional scanning trained through pattern recognition in through these patterns of play where the player should be. And since he always had like five different places that he could play the ball, he needed to develop a scanning. And he did that. And he looked before he received, where can I play? Blah, blah, blah. And he always could play the free player because the system was great for that. It would be great to see Savi playing in a in a non-league team, and then see, his scanning, or he would probably scan the same amount, but I think he would be more confused.
I think his emotional control would definitely be tested, wouldn't it? The I mean, it is interesting again when you go down this road. You talked a little bit about centre backs there, and I'm sorry, right backs and the defensive line. I mean, that's something that's never referenced. Of when you talk about scanning, we do kind of zone in again as a coaching community on the eights, the tens, the sixes, even the nines. You're saying there's a world here, even out of possession, for defenders to check and look and
If you think about a right back, right, who has to control for the left side of the pitch, right? That's almost like if he's well trained, that's just within his movement. He'll do that constantly, just check what's going on inside the pitch, and also in relation to the sideline and other things. But one thing that we've looked into is that what happens when you now take your right back and put him on left back. And what happens is that the frequency of scanning, what we saw, fell down because he's not used to making that scan, right? Because he's one-sided in his scanning. And we even saw instances of that led to goals against or chances against, because now that millisecond move up, move down was not happening at the same skill level. Um, so and in these instances, I would always argue, if you have a right back that you want to play left back in the weekend, make sure that you give him, 5 training passes in that other side, so he can adapt to moving his head in basically the other direction.
yeah, I am fascinated by I'm fascinated by all this, but I'm really fascinated by the position component of it. Would you say that's where the gains are in terms of putting this on the training pitch? Is the gains or maybe the most gains from a position specific training element, or how do you see that?
Well, when you have a style of play, you often have prioritized plays, right? Or you do have prioritized plays. So the question is for the coach, what is the prioritized play rather than how much is he scanning? And if the prioritized play is for, the six to connect with the eight, or for the six to connect with the wing, then make sure that that's what you're training him towards. that you're actually giving him guidelines on, I want you, when the ball is coming towards you from the right back, I want you to secure that area in your scan so he can actually play the ball, right? Because otherwise it just helps him. It makes it easier for him to make the decision because now he's collecting the information. Yeah.
There's a lot of talk today about verticality in football, and I think, and a lot of coaches trying to prioritize it. So I think you mentioned about studying philosophy. God, that could be a separate podcast where you're like, how does, because some people are hanging their hat today on philosophy, and I think people want to be more pragmatic, but they want to do it a trendy way. So that's called verticality. And I wonder how much that, again, looking from a player development standpoint, saying, okay, are they scanning? Are they getting information? Versus, are you actually looking? Have you looked forward? So if you've received, are you aware of the movement of the nine? Are you aware of the last line of defense? Uh, what's your thoughts on that?
I would say I studied Holland a lot, and looking into his specific scanning technique as a striker, we found that in the box, he's scanning almost once per second. And what we realized is that the way that he scans in the box is very, very specific to him, but is extremely valuable for young strikers to know. So what you often see is, I don't know if this is answering the question, Gary, but so what you often see is that young strikers look. So if you have an open ball for a deep run or a cross, you often see that the young striker is actually looking too much at the ball and the player with the ball. And what is happening is that he's not positioning himself in a way where he's strategically has the upper hand to the central back. So what we would argue is that he needs to be able to make small, fast scans to the ball, make sure that he knows where it is, but then positioning himself on blind sides to both center backs, so that the center backs are the ones now. You now give them the responsibility to scan you, right? So you want to have that upper hand of information constantly. So what he's doing is always on the far center back in his blind side. So he has to scan, and the other center back has to scan. No one knows where you are, and as soon as the ball switches, you go on the other side. So now you're giving that mental effort to the center back, and you have a way easier way now to scan. So and he does the same in deep runs. He goes on the blind side. So now the player defending, he has to run and scan where Holland is. Whereas if you're running in front of him, he doesn't have to scan. Just have to look at the ball and look at you. So that would be, but it's not so easy because players tend to get very ball fixated. So they go into the box and they just start looking at when is the cross coming, when is the cross coming. The cross comes, but they know who you are, where you are, so they just go up and heads the ball away, right? But if at that moment it's crossed, they have to look, oh, where's Gary now? You have that second of information, which is going back to leaving stage one, stage two, leaving stage two to your opposition so that you are in that moment of being able to act on whatever information comes in.
You mentioned there about going through the process of watching all the Copenhagen teams play at all the different age groups. Would you? You don't have to share, divulge anything on the Copenhagen team, but do you think that it's important to see this again going to the training pitch and saying, okay, if you're going to a club and looking at impacting this here, do you think that's somewhere that you need to look at?
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about coaches wanting to be practical, as you mentioned before, I think you can be practical, but you either need from an intellectual or a practical point of view understand the basics of learning, and those are of course complex topics, but ecological psychology, which m- most coaches today are training in. whether they know it or not, is basically the idea that the that you can only become perceptually better within the specific demands of the system you're trying to get better at, right? So that's basically the rule number one. So if you go to a club and they're not really understanding this and they're just playing, passes back and forth in a static game, then they're not really utilizing that knowledge. So that would be the first thing I would look for, is to make as holistic and representative or specific tasks to even go into cognition. Because if you don't have that, then you just have that pass back and forth, and then a cognitive test, and then you have everything in isolation. So you need to acknowledge that football happens with 22 players within specific demands of your body and your brain, and then go into, so what are those specific demands that we then want to increase? Is it the player's ability to be concentrated within that environment? That's a problem for many young players, being concentrated. Is it the ability to inhibit responses, basically not do a certain pass? That's also something that is very, very important. And we know that from many studies that the ability to inhibit is highly correlated with success in youth players. The scanning technique, and then are we training them within this pattern that we actually want them to succeed in? And then we go into the positions and say, what are then the specific demands for the position? But you mentioned academies, and I think maybe in academies it's more important. This is just my theory, but within academies it's more important to have all of this knowledge implicit. That you just devise good training that make sure that the players are within environments that nurtures their ability to make decisions. Really important thing for me when you do scanning exercises, make sure that there's an actual decision at the end of that exercise. But what we realized is that actually first team players are great recipients of analysis of this, because they're already professional athletes. They're already working with how to optimize. And many of these processes are things we can devise and training for, but you can also make it very deliberate and conscious to them, because you can show them 10 matches, you can show them 50 situations in which they didn't prepare, and you can help them a lot. And the slower you become, the more important it is to be fast in your mind. And that's some of the best conversations on football I've had, was actually with the older players, because they knew they couldn't outrun the young players anymore, but they could be smarter than them. So giving them insight into how they are behaving, how we can optimize that, was for me one of the most fulfilling things I've ever done in football.
Brilliant. Brilliant.
Because we're always focusing on the young, right? How do we make these perfect football players? Yeah, but you can also make the ones you have a lot better.
I'm not trying to get a hot take from you here on this one, but you're if you're sitting there as a coach listening to this and you've got an email in front of you that's saying, hey, this program with 5 lights and players can run to the lights, I'm guessing that that's a waste of time.
Not if you know why you're doing it. That's how much I would say. I'm not gonna say that everything is good or bad, but I'm just gonna say if you don't know what you're doing, and often, you know, anecdotally, I know a lot of cognitive data is being collected, but I know very few instances of clubs really, really utilizing that data. So so let's say now, Gary, so I test 100 academy players, right? And we do it on 5 cognitive tests. It would be attention, working memory, cognitive flexibility, inhibition. Yeah, let's say those 4. And we test 100, and there's one that's 100 and one is 0, right? And you've never seen them play football, right? What would your hypothesis be on those players? Would you say that the one that had the highest score was the best player?
Oh, 1,000,000%. Yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I wouldn't. He might just be really, really smart, but really bad at football.
Yeah.
Um, I would say that, let's say they were all academy players then. I would say that there's a high chance that the upper bracket, 25%, were likely good players in their age group. But that's the most I would say. I would say there's a big likelihood that they are good players. But I'm not sure at all. I would only be sure if you allowed me to watch them play football
Mm.
and do my analysis and then utilize my my cognitive testing to then make the foundation to understand this player's potential or loss of potential, right? And so, often just players haven't been trained in it, or we often see that players with high cognitive scores tend to be good players, but there are also players with high cognitive scores that never make it. So it's not a safe bet. And I would rather have video analysis of a player using our cognitive methods to analyze than any test in the world.
But
But I would say that the better cognitive perceptual skills you have, the more likely you are to be adaptable, the more likely we are to being able to train you. But it doesn't make you faster, it doesn't make your technique better. But and especially in a club like Copenhagen, where tactical discipline and decision making is very important, that's the thing you want to control for because you want to know, okay, what is actually the cognitive skill set that this player has. But you know, 10 years ago, I think it was, cognitive science thought that working memory couldn't go higher as than 10 units. Like you could only remember 10 units in your head, right? But now we have people who remember millions of units because some people sat down and investigated this and just trained themselves to actually be able to remember millions and millions of things. So your brain, especially when you're young, can be trained, right? Geniuses, if you ask me, are not born, they're made. And great players are not born, they're made by the right environment and the right coaches. And, of course, genetic disposition is important, but you need to give them the right environment. And if a player is cognitively not doing well, then train him. That's neuroplasticity. That's probably one of the most fundamental facts about the brain is that it's plastic and you can change. You can learn how to play guitar or you can unlearn how to play guitar if you don't play.
data's kind of come under fire in the last few years with people uh, that are maybe and disillusioned with it, but maybe they were oversold what data could bring to them. I mean, I think you've definitely shown in this interview that the level of depth you go into alongside the data is. I guess my question would be: do you think data analysts? You said it was one of the first things you said. They're just crunching outputs and crunching numbers. Do you think we need to, in order to maybe maximize this area of clubs, do we need to upskill data analysts a little bit more to get them involved in this? Or what's your thoughts?
Well, so currently I'm the director of football and data science, so it's what I do every day. Look at data, and I think there's brilliant data scientists out there, and I also think that there's brilliant tools for analyzing football data. And remember that the financial market basically is all data analysts by now, and they're analyzing extremely complex processes and movements within the market. So I would say that a lot of the statistical tools that we have. But the biggest problem that I see is actually a different one. So It's not enough to have a great data analyst if the sporting director disagrees with the style of play to the head coach, and the physical team doesn't train the players in the way that the technical director wants because he has a fourth way of playing. So it's really about alignment. And there's some great examples of Brentford, Brighton, Union Saint Gilloise, Club Brugge, Como recently, clubs that are just sitting down and making a strategy from basically the board of directors to the U14 head coach in saying, this is how we play, this is our KPIs, and this is how we understand data. Because what like if you're building a bridge and you have a brilliant data scientist, but no one is listening to him, then it doesn't matter. And so it's the same here. I think that people needs to understand what data can bring and what it can't bring, and then utilize that in creating models that are making sure your scouting and recruitment and your training aligns with that. Bodø Glimt, an amazing example of that, small Norwegian club that's doing amazingly because they're so aligned. And so data, like always, XG came out and everyone said like, oh, you just scout using XG, right? And one thing is, many people I think is misinterpreting what XG is. That's another story. But it's not enough just to look at XG. Rather, you want to see if we're Bournemouth or we're Liverpool, what are the demands? Who can do that? What is the cost of those players? How can we buy them? And how can we then implement them into an environment where they can do that? And so I think actually data scientists that I know are brilliant, and they're probably taking half the pay that they could get in the financial system. But you need also the president and the sporting director to believe in it, and the head coach.
Yeah, if you're, I mean, you're in a situation at the minute where, again, correct me if I'm wrong, you lead big aspirations to compete at a world stage, and you do need that ecosystem of alignment of coaches, technical directors, sporting directors. Do you think that that's through coach education, or because in the US, like you've been over here, similar, not similar path, but similar challenges in terms of a lot of professional clubs now growing, but that alignment is the experience around sporting directors is a very new role over here. Coaching staffs are growing probably from 2 to 5 in the last 5 to 10 years, so there's a growth there. Physical departments doing the same, and they're, I see it, struggling with alignment. I mean,
Yeah.
how would you fix that problem, or what do you think would make a difference there?
I mean, it's basically to that the leadership gives the sporting director this responsibility and make sure that he is acting upon it, but also that you're then hiring a coach that can do that. You also see like clubs that are hiring a different type of coach constantly and then buying a new team to fit him, and then they have to fire him, and then they have this team that's playing 5-3-2, and then they get a 4-4-2 coach. And like, you have to think about this in all areas. Which coaches are we getting? What players are we getting? How are we analyzing the data? And I always like the brutal thing about football is that, so I always give the example of how many companies in US now is producing toilet paper, right? You don't know, right? You don't know. But my guess is that if we took all toilet paper factories, there's probably one that are demand cities and the Bayern Münchens, and there's probably some that are, I'm not gonna say a team, but that are not doing well. But the difference is that the bottom toilet factories, it's not the whole world looking at them every weekend saying, "Oh, now they fired Gary again. He was the one who could do these things," right? So we're in an industry where everyone is analyzing constantly, and you can see it on the pitch every weekend whether we won or lost. And so doing that alignment while the world is watching is really, really difficult. And then people might disagree with alignments, right? But you saw what, the story of Moneyball and Billy Bean, and right, that's an alignment on how do we do this, and that's the consistency. And I've been doing PCA analysis of styles of play on different teams, and I think there's literature out there as well, uh, you know, indicating that teams that have a consistent style of play tend to do better. And so it's a football club is not just the head coach and the players; it's everyone helping them achieve that. Um, and also, just like 20 years ago, how many clubs had analysts, right? I mean, there's this brilliant podcast in Training Ground Guru with Mark Leland, I think he's called, where he's talking about becoming an analyst in Man City. And it's like when he came, no one really heard about it. And we forget that that's also an evolving role. We have to figure out what is the analyst actually doing, because now they're doing opponent, pre-match, post-match, training analysis, data analysis, set piece analysis. They're just being swamped with all of these things. Um, that like we need to give some of the analytical responsibility also back to other parts of the of the coaching staff and maybe the leadership. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think that's I mean, it seems that that's where the tension lies today in a lot of like you're saying there about because everyone will say there's alignment similar to coaching. Preseason, it's going well. Everyone can sit in the room and look at a spreadsheet and go, that's what our values are. You lose 3 games and all of a sudden behaviors start to move and the goalposts start to move. Um, I mean, do you see that in your world? Do you see that we move to neuroscience departments at youth development, or do you think we're still a million miles off that?
Well, I would say that the interest in the topic is definitely increasing, without a doubt. But and maybe I'm learning from data, because I've been in data as well. I've analyzed it a lot, and I think one of the missteps of that movement was not to be entirely clear on how it fitted in, and not to be entirely clear that context is king, right? So you would have people say, "Oh, we use our data department to find who's the good players." But that's not really how it works, right? And so that's what I think my approach is a lot about, is that don't exclude the coaches, don't exclude the practitioners when you develop a theory of training or performance. Include them and make sure that their ideas and their reality is reflected in what you're doing, because you saw like XG in the danger zone was important, right? So you want to have shots from the danger zone, sure, but like that's not really solving the problem, right? Solving the problem is, how do you get to the danger zone? So now we have information telling us never make long shots because you have a 1% chance of scoring. So clubs are not doing long shots anymore. Great. But now you have to figure out, how do you then score goals? And data is just going to tell you where's the highest likelihood of that. And that's great information, but it doesn't tell you how do you get in there. So that is also on the coach. And of course, you can then make analysis on movements and all kinds of things where you can also use data. Um, but the coach needs to be part of that, to develop his ideas about it. Yeah.
Brilliant. Guys, unbelievable. I have absolutely loved this. This is fantastic. Appreciate first of all, I appreciate you coming on, and second of all, I really, really appreciate all the work you're doing in this area, and thank you on behalf of the coaches for pushing the bar.
Yeah, no worries. If I can come with one last remark,
Yeah, yeah, let's go.
because it's so up, I follow the stock market, and I can see Nvidia and Palantir and all these AI solutions. I know it's not in football necessarily, but right. But I also now speak with software companies about AI and football, and I just think that one thing that's really, really important for analysts and coaches is that you always sit down and actually understand the data before you ask AI to give you the conclusions of the data. So, just to give an example of that, if you load a data set into ChatGPT or Julius, it will then come up with basically uh, less good tactical strategies. You can ask it to do that. And what it will say is that teams that are tactically set up to do crosses do less well than teams that don't do crosses, right? So now it's telling you don't do crosses, right? But reality is that if you know the context, you know that clubs do crosses when they don't have the ability to get the ball into the box in any other way, right? So now you're getting a conclusion from a symptom and not due to an actual tactical strategy. And that's where I just think, we can also have scouting AI where they just find the players that fit the most and all of these things. But you really, really have to get the data, put it in an Excel sheet, look at it, understand it through the Excel, and then you can ask AI to do your calculations. But don't overstep that gap, which is so easily to do nowadays. Don't overstep that gap. Understand the data before you look into the black box, because that will make you a better coach.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, you're probably sitting there talking about symptom. That's where it is going for efficiency of or scaling. Everything's looking to scale now, and there's companies
Yeah,
that look to do that, but you probably need to catch yourself in that way as a department, the
yeah,
football department.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, make sure you understand the context of the data because AI hasn't watched the match. It's just watched the data. And the data is not perfect.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh,
Brilliant.
okay.
Brilliant. Cheers, outstanding. This has been great. Thank you so much for coming on. Need to get you on for a round two.
Yeah, let's see. We can talk about maybe about data, but of course, neuroscience is the love of my life, and hopefully it can help some people refine their coaching skills.